You're grounded until you apologize to your brother." My father said it loud enough for all 30 relatives to hear. For a second, nobody moved. Then my aunt leaned toward my cousin and whispered something that made them laugh. Austin didn't laugh. He just smiled. That smile told me more than words ever could. My name is Claire Hawthorne. I was 27 and somehow, in front of 30 relatives, my father had just grounded me like I was 15. "You'll stay in this house tonight," Dad said. "No car, no company login. Tomorrow you'll apologize to Austin." "Dad, I didn't authorize that contract." Austin lowered his eyes. "I never said you did," he replied softly. He sounded almost hurt, almost innocent. Dad pointed toward the stairs. "Enough, Claire." I could have argued. Instead, I took a breath. "Okay." I walked upstairs while the laughter followed me. 3 days earlier, Austin had approved a $480,000 vendor contract without the required review. Within 48 hours, the deal collapsed, and one of our biggest clients walked away. When I confronted him, he insisted everything had been authorized. So I checked the company's approval system. My electronic authorization was attached to the contract, except I had never approved it. Someone had used my credentials, and Austin had been one of the few people who'd asked me for access that week. This wasn't the first time I'd protected him. 2 years earlier, Austin had missed a critical shipment deadline that nearly cost us another major client. I stayed at the office until 3 in the morning fixing his mistake. Dad never knew. Austin did. Now he was standing beside Dad while I took the blame. I reached my bedroom and closed the door. For several seconds, I stood there, trying to understand how easily my father had chosen Austin's story over mine. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was a thin black folder. I hadn't touched it in 3 years. The label read, "Hawthorne Logistics, Ownership Transfer." I sat down slowly. Dad had been CEO for nearly 20 years. He controlled the employees, operations, and company systems. But he didn't control the ownership. 3 years earlier, my grandfather had legally transferred a controlling block of shares to me. Dad simply didn't know. I'd kept it secret because Grandpa made me promise not to reveal it until the right time. I opened the folder. Attached to the final page was a handwritten note. 6 words, "Trust no one inside the company." My breath caught. Someone had forged my authorization. Grandpa had warned me about people inside the company 3 years ago. Suddenly, that $480,000 contract didn't look like an accident. I closed the folder. I wasn't smiling because I owned the company. I already knew I did. I was smiling because my family had just given me the perfect reason to discover who had framed me and why. Dad could take away my company login. He couldn't take away my shares. And by tomorrow morning, he was going to learn exactly what my grandfather had known all along. At 7:12 the next morning, I heard my father laughing downstairs. "Finally learned her lesson," he said. Austin laughed softly beside him. I walked into the kitchen. Dad looked up from his coffee. "Good, you're still here. Where else would I go?" He smiled, then apologized to your brother. Austin looked uncomfortable. "Claire, I don't want us fighting." For the first time, I wasn't sure whether he was pretending. I pulled out my phone. "When did you first see the vendor contract?" His expression tightened. "Why?" "Because my authorization was attached to it." Austin stared at me. "I thought you approved it." "I didn't." Dad sighed. "Enough. Let's not turn breakfast into another argument." He didn't sound defensive. He sounded tired. That mattered. I looked back at Austin. "Who sent you the final version?" He hesitated. "I honestly don't remember." That answer bothered me more than an accusation would have. I called Mr. Vance, our family attorney. "Vance, I need the ownership documents and everything." Grandpa left concerning Hawthorne Logistics. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. 22 minutes later, Vance walked through the front door carrying a slim file. Dad stood. "What is this about?" "Claire asked me to bring these," Vance said. Dad frowned. "You're forgetting who runs this company." Vance looked directly at him. "No, I think you're forgetting who owns it." Silence filled the kitchen. Austin stared at me. Vance placed the ownership papers on the table. "Your grandfather transferred controlling shares to Claire 3 years ago. The transfer was properly recorded." Dad's jaw tightened. "But I'm still CEO." "Yes," Vance replied. "And Claire is the controlling shareholder." I opened the file. Inside was an audit authorization signed by Grandpa 3 years earlier. He ordered an independent review of company finances, Vance explained, but the investigation was stopped before it was completed. Who stopped it? We never proved who. I studied the documents myself. Then I found something. Grandpa's audit contained an invoice from the same vendor Austin had supposedly discovered only weeks ago. I checked the date. The invoice was nearly 6 months older than Austin's first recorded contact with the vendor. I looked at Austin. You said you found them recently. I did. Then why was Hawthorne paying them 6 months before you contacted them? Austin's face went pale. I don't know. For once, he didn't sound defensive. He sounded genuinely frightened. I checked the approval trail again. Austin wasn't listed as the original contact. Neither was Dad. Another employee's credentials appeared beside the vendor account. Someone who had worked inside Hawthorne Logistics for years. Someone I had trusted. Someone who had access to the same approval system as me. I looked at Vance. Who is that? He didn't answer immediately. And suddenly, Grandpa's warning made sense. He hadn't been warning me about Austin. He had been warning me about someone who had been inside. Hawthorne Logistics long before Austin ever signed that contract. Vance finally turned the document toward me. Daniel Mercer. I knew the name immediately. Daniel had been Hawthorne Logistics' chief financial officer for 11 years. Grandpa trusted him. Dad trusted him. I had trusted him more than anyone outside my immediate family. He can't be involved, I whispered. Vance didn't argue. I didn't say he was. He pointed to the audit. Look at the payment trail. I followed his finger. The vendor hadn't simply received $480,000. There had been 7 smaller payments over 18 months, all approved through a finance account controlled by Daniel. My stomach tightened. Why didn't anyone notice? Because each payment was below the internal review threshold, Vance said. Individually, they looked ordinary, but together, they tell a different story. I pulled out my phone and photographed every page. Then I noticed something else. The payments weren't going directly to the vendor. They were being routed through another company, a shell company with almost the same mailing address. I looked at Vance. Who owns it? He hesitated. We're still checking. No, I said. Check now. While he made the call, I opened the company's approval logs on my laptop. My access had been removed. Dad had kept his promise. But shareholder access was different. Vance had given me a secure copy of the corporate records. And those records showed something my employee account never could. 3 days before Austin signed the $480,000 contract, someone had logged into my approval profile. The login came from inside our headquarters. At 11:43 p.m., I stared at the timestamp. I wasn't there. Vance nodded. Neither was Austin. I looked at him. How do you know? Security footage. He opened another file. The hallway camera showed Daniel entering the finance floor at 11:39 p.m. 4 minutes later, he left. My hands went cold. That proves he was there. It proves he entered the floor, Vance said. Not what he did. Then his phone rang. He listened for several seconds. His expression changed. Claire. What? The shell company has a registered director. He turned the screen toward me. I stared at the name. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Austin. It wasn't Dad. It was my grandfather's former estate manager, Thomas Reed. My grandfather had died 3 years ago. Thomas had disappeared from our lives immediately afterward. I remembered Grandpa once telling me, if Thomas ever leaves, don't ask where he went. At the time, I thought it was strange. Now it felt like a warning. I looked at the audit again. The first suspicious payment had been made exactly 2 weeks before. Grandpa transferred his controlling shares to me. My heart started pounding. Grandpa hadn't transferred the company because he was simply protecting me from Dad and Austin. He had discovered something serious enough to make him change the ownership of everything. And suddenly, I wasn't investigating who stole $480,000 anymore. I was investigating what my grandfather had discovered before he died. Vance looked at me. Claire, there's one more file. He opened a sealed envelope bearing my grandfather's name. Inside was a letter dated 2 weeks before. Grandpa transferred the controlling shares to me. I read the first paragraph twice. Daniel Mercer isn't the mastermind. I looked up. Vance continued. Your grandfather discovered the shell companies. Daniel found unusual transactions and quietly started tracing them. Then why were Daniel's credentials used? Because someone wanted him to look guilty. That explained the late-night login, the forged approval, the suspicious payments. But it raised an even bigger question. Who was Daniel working with? Vance slid another document toward me. It was a private meeting log from Grandpa's office. 3 meetings. Dad, Daniel, and Thomas Reed. All 3 had met privately during the month before. Grandpa transferred the shares. None of those meetings appeared in the company's official records. Why were they hidden? We don't know, Vance said. But Thomas may. My heart jumped. What happened to him? We found him. Where? Arizona. He'd been living under his middle name. Did he tell you why he disappeared? Vance nodded. He said your grandfather paid him to leave quietly. Because he knew about the shell companies? More than that. Thomas said Grandpa believed someone inside. Hawthorne was manipulating the company from within. He placed a photograph on the table. It showed Dad, Daniel, and Thomas outside an old warehouse. Dad was shaking Daniel's hand. The photograph didn't prove fraud, but Grandpa's meeting records proved they had been discussing something together. The picture simply confirmed they had met. I stared at Dad's face. Did Thomas say what they were discussing? Vance shook his head. He refused to identify the person responsible. He said Grandpa made him promise not to. Why? Because Grandpa believed naming that person too early could put you at risk. My stomach tightened. For 3 years, I'd thought Grandpa gave me control because he wanted to protect the company from Dad and Austin. Now I understood it differently. He had given me control because he feared what would happen if someone else gained control first. And Dad? I still couldn't tell whether he was part of the scheme, protecting someone, or simply hiding something Grandpa never told him. That uncertainty frightened me more than knowing he was guilty. I closed the file. Then we're done guessing. Vance looked at me. What are you going to do? Call a board meeting. Dad walked into the room before Vance could respond. What are you two planning? I looked directly at him. I want the truth. His expression hardened. About what? Everything. For once, Austin said nothing. Tomorrow, the people who had spent 3 years hiding behind my family's name would have to sit across the table from the person who legally owned the company. And this time, they wouldn't be able to laugh me out of the room.